The first night I realized I might not make it out of those mountains alive. The forest went quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like something had noticed me noticing it. My name is Marcus Hale. I was 38 years old when this happened, born and raised in eastern Ohio. The kind of guy who grew up believing that if you respected the land, it would respect you back. I'd spent most of my adult life working maintenance contracts, drifting from town to town, never staying long enough to grow roots. The only constant I allowed myself was my old Volkswagen camper van, a faded orange 78 with more miles than pride, but it had carried me through deserts, plains, and forests without complaint. Until Appalachia. I went there alone on purpose. I told myself it was about solitude, about needing quiet after a year that had scraped me raw. A divorce finalized with signatures that felt heavier than any spoken goodbye. A father who'd passed without warning. A house that echoed even when I wasn't inside it anymore. I didn't want company. I wanted distance. I wanted somewhere old and vast enough that my thoughts would finally shrink to something manageable. The campground I chose wasn't really a campground, just a marked clearing off a narrow Forest Service road in West Virginia, deep enough into the Appalachian spine that my phone lost signal 20 minutes before I arrived. The map called it primitive, which I'd learned was a polite way of saying no one was coming to help if something went wrong. When I parked the van, the first thing I noticed was the smell. Damp leaves layered over rot, iron-rich soil, and something faintly sweet underneath it all, like overripe fruit left too long in the sun. The air felt thick, almost chewable, and colder than it should have been for late summer. My breath fogged for just a second before vanishing. I told myself it was elevation. I told myself a lot of things. I set up camp methodically, the way I always did. Level the van, kill the engine. Step out and listen. Normally, forests greet you with noise, birds arguing, insects clicking, wind threading through branches. Here there was sound, but it felt distant, restrained, like it was happening somewhere else, and I'd stumbled into the pause between breaths. Still, I cooked dinner, canned chili heated on a portable burner. I ate standing up, watching the tree line as the light thinned and shadows stretched into long, crooked fingers. Every now and then, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing. Just trunks, packed too close together, rising straight and unforgiving, like pillars in a ruined cathedral. I remember thinking, not for the first time, that Appalachia doesn't feel like wilderness. It feels occupied. Night fell fast, faster than it should have. One moment the sky was bruised purple, the next it was black, heavy with cloud cover that swallowed the stars. I climbed into the van, slid the door shut, and locked it. The metal made a hollow, final sound that echoed more than I liked. Inside, it was warmer, but not comfortable. The van creaked as it cooled, metal ticking like a countdown. I lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to my own breathing and trying to convince myself that the unease curling in my stomach was just the adjustment period, city nerves recalibrating to real darkness. That's when I heard the first knock. It was soft. Not on the door, but on the side panel near the back. 3 slow taps, evenly spaced. Tap, tap, tap. I held my breath, waiting for the follow-up. A voice, a laugh, footsteps retreating. None came. I told myself it was a branch, wind. Maybe a pine cone falling just right. Appalachia was full of old trees, after all. Then it happened again. Tap, 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 tap. This time closer to the driver's side, higher up. My skin prickled. I sat up, heart thudding loud enough that I was sure it could be heard outside. I leaned forward, peering through the small side window, but the darkness pressed back, absolute and unbroken. "Hello?" I called, my voice thinner than I expected. The word vanished into the trees. No answer came back, not even an echo. Silence settled again, but it wasn't neutral anymore. It felt loaded. Expectant. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I drifted close, some sound would pull me back. Leaves crunching slowly, deliberately, not like an animal passing through, but like something pacing. Once I heard what sounded like breathing outside the van, shallow and uneven, lingering too long near the rear doors. By dawn, my nerves were shot, but I was stubborn. I'd driven all this way to be alone, and I wasn't about to let my imagination chase me off after one uneasy night. Morning light revealed nothing out of place. No footprints, no scratches, just damp earth and the same unbroken wall of trees. I spent the day hiking short trails nearby, never straying too far from the van. The forest felt different in daylight, but not friendlier. It pressed in from all sides, branches tangling overhead, blocking the sun so that even at noon, everything lived in a permanent state of dusk. At one point I smelled smoke. Not campfire smoke, something sharper, acrid. It drifted through the trees and vanished as quickly as it came. I followed it instinctively, then stopped myself. A sudden wave of certainty washing over me that stepping off the trail would be a mistake I couldn't undo. That night, the knocks returned. This time, they weren't polite. They came from all sides, uneven, impatient. Sometimes 2 taps, sometimes 5. Once, a long scraping sound ran the length of the van, slow and deliberate, like fingernails dragged across metal. I curled inward, every muscle locked tight, replaying every rational explanation I could think of. Animals, vandals, locals messing with an outsider. But none of those explanations explained the rhythm, the persistence, or the way the sound seemed to respond to my movements inside, shifting position as I shifted mine. At some point, somewhere between fear and exhaustion, I heard my name. It was faint, almost lost in the trees. A man's voice, low and careful, like it didn't want to startle me. Marcus. I froze. No one out there should have known my name. The voice came again, closer this time, right outside the driver's window. Marcus, you okay in there? It sounded wrong. Not distorted, not monstrous, just off. Like someone reciting a line they'd practiced but didn't fully understand. My mind raced. Had I said my name out loud earlier? Was this some cruel coincidence? I pressed my hand over my mouth, afraid to breathe too loud. The voice sighed. Then the knocking stopped altogether. In the sudden quiet, something else made itself known. A deep, resonant hum that seemed to rise from the ground itself, vibrating through the van's frame and into my bones. It wasn't sound so much as pressure, like the mountains were leaning in, listening. I realized then that this wasn't about fear of dying. It was about the growing certainty that I had been invited here, and that whatever was waiting in those woods was patient enough to see whether I would choose to leave or stay. And that was when I understood my mistake. I hadn't come to Appalachia to be alone. I'd come to hide. And the mountains do not like it when you try to disappear inside them. I didn't move for a long time after the humming faded because I was afraid motion itself might be a signal, some unspoken permission I didn't mean to give. Dawn came reluctantly, gray and colorless, like the light itself was exhausted. I stepped out of the van, stiff and hollow-eyed, every sense tuned too high. The air smelled different than the day before. Sharper, metallic again, but now layered with something sour like wet fur or spoiled meat left too close to heat. I walked the perimeter slowly, scanning the ground, the trees, the spaces between them. Still no footprints, no marks, nothing to prove that the night had been real. That absence unsettled me more than evidence would have. I packed up breakfast without appetite, hands shaking as I poured stale coffee into a dented mug. I told myself I'd leave after one more day. Just one. I didn't want to give fear the satisfaction of chasing me out. That stubbornness, that need to prove something to myself, has always been my weakness. It kept me in a failing marriage longer than I should have stayed. It kept me working jobs that drained me dry. And there, in those mountains, it kept me rooted to a place that was quietly, methodically unmaking me. Around midday, I heard laughter. It came from deeper in the woods, carried on the slope of the hills, echoing in a way that made it impossible to place. It sounded like children at first, high, breathless bursts, but the rhythm was wrong, too even, too controlled. It didn't rise and fall naturally. It looped like a recording stuck on repeat. I stood there frozen, coffee cooling in my hand, listening as the sound drifted closer, then abruptly cut off. The silence afterward rang in my ears. I told myself again that Appalachia was full of people, hikers, locals, hunters. but the road I'd driven in on was barely wide enough for one vehicle, and I hadn't seen another soul since arriving. No tire tracks, no distant engines, just me and that endless forest pressing inward. That afternoon, I noticed something else. The trees seemed closer. I know how that sounds. Trees don't move. I know that. But the space between the trunks felt tighter, like the forest had subtly rearranged itself while I wasn't paying attention. Paths I'd walked the day before didn't line up the same way. A fallen log I remembered stepping over was gone. In its place, the ground dipped sharply, hidden beneath leaves darkened with moisture. Disorientation crept in quietly. I'd check my compass, reassure myself of north and south, then look up and feel the same doubt return, heavy and persistent. The mountains rose around me in every direction, ridgelines folding into each other like knuckles clenched too tight. As the light began to fade again, I made a decision that should have come sooner. I was leaving at first light. That night, I didn't wait for darkness to trap me in the van. I sat awake, engine key in my pocket, boots on, every muscle coiled. The knocks started earlier than before, just after sunset. This time they weren't testing, they were demanding. The sound came from the roof. A heavy weight shifted above me, metal groaning under pressure. Something moved slowly from front to back, then paused directly over where I sat. Dust drifted down from the ceiling seams. I stared upward, heart slamming, a cold certainty settling in my gut that whatever was up there knew exactly where I was. Then came the smell. It flooded the van all at once, rotting leaves, copper, and something unmistakably human. Sweat, old breath, the stench of a body that hadn't seen clean water in a long time. I gagged, clamping a hand over my mouth. From above me, a voice whispered, not my name this time, but something worse. You shouldn't be alone out here. It wasn't wrong. The pressure lifted suddenly, replaced by the sound of something dropping lightly to the ground beside the van. Footsteps circled me, slow and deliberate, crunching leaves with careful weight. I caught glimpses through the windows, shadows stretching and collapsing, shapes that stood upright longer than they should have. I snapped. Adrenaline drowned out reason. I shoved the key into the ignition, twisted hard, and the engine roared to life, shattering the night. Headlights cut through the trees, illuminating trunks and undergrowth. And for just a fraction of a second, something else. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, unnaturally still, tall, too thin. Its arms hung low, elbows bending the wrong way, and its face, God, its face, looked like it was wearing an expression it had borrowed. A smile stretched across features that didn't quite fit together, eyes reflecting the headlights like an animal caught in the road. Then it stepped back into the trees and was gone. I didn't hesitate again. The van lurched forward, tires spinning briefly in damp soil before catching. Branches scraped along the sides as I barreled down the narrow road, heart in my throat, hands locked, white knuckle on the wheel. The forest closed in, headlights carving a tunnel through darkness that seemed eager to swallow me whole. Behind me, something screamed. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pain. It was loss. The sound chased me, echoing through the hollows, bouncing off rock and wood until I couldn't tell if it was behind me or inside my own skull. I drove faster than I should have, trusting muscle memory over sight, praying the road wouldn't betray me with a sudden drop or fallen tree. When I finally burst back onto pavement, the scream cut off mid-note like a cord severed. I didn't stop driving until the sun rose and burned the mist off the valleys. I didn't stop until my hands stopped shaking and my chest stopped aching from breaths taken too shallow for too long. Weeks later, safe and far away, I tried to make sense of it. I read about Appalachia, about its history, about isolated communities, old traditions, and the kind of stories people tell in low voices when they think outsiders aren't listening, about places that don't like to be intruded upon, places that don't forget. I learned something else too, something harder to accept. Every time I'd felt watched, I had been. Not by something hunting me, by something measuring me, testing how much space I would take, how long I would stay, whether I would listen to the part of myself that knew when it was time to leave. I still camp. I still travel, but I don't camp alone anymore, and I don't go back to places that feel like they're holding their breath, because some parts of this country don't want to be explored. They want to be respected. And if you mistake silence for safety in the wrong stretch of woods, the mountains will remind you just how small you really are. I thought leaving Appalachia would end it. That distance alone would cauterize whatever had latched onto me in those woods. But fear doesn't respect geography, and memory doesn't care about state lines. For weeks after I got back, I slept in fragments. Every creak of the van settling at night snapped me awake. Every unexpected knock, someone closing a car door nearby, a neighbor tapping on a fence, sent my heart racing like I was back in that clearing, counting taps and waiting for them to say my name again. I tried staying in RV parks at first, places full of people and lights and the illusion of safety, but even there I caught myself scanning tree lines that weren't there, sniffing the air for that metallic rot that had soaked into my clothes and lungs. The worst part wasn't the fear. It was the shame. I'd built my entire identity around self-reliance, around the idea that solitude was strength, that needing no one meant you were whole. Appalachia cracked that belief open and showed me what loneliness really is when it stops being a choice. Out there alone didn't mean peaceful. It meant unobserved, unprotected, available. I told myself not to talk about it. People don't listen well to stories that don't fit neat categories. If it wasn't a bear, a trespasser, or a prank, then it must have been stress, imagination, grief playing tricks on a tired mind. I tried to believe that version because the alternative, that something ancient and watchful had decided I didn't belong, felt too big to carry. Then I found the scratches. They were faint, almost invisible unless the light hit them just right, etched into the van's roof above the driver's seat. Long, shallow lines parallel like someone had tested the metal with careful restraint. I didn't remember them being there before. I climbed up on a stool, fingers tracing the grooves, and felt that same pressure settle behind my eyes. Measuring. I sold the Volkswagen not long after. That decision hurt more than I expected. The van had been my refuge, my proof that I could exist untethered. But every time I climbed inside it, the air felt wrong. Too close, too reminiscent of breathing I couldn't place. Letting it go felt like admitting something had followed me out of those mountains, even if only in memory. I started traveling differently after that. Planned routes, booked sites, introduced myself to neighbors. I learned the rhythms of shared space again, the comfort of voices carried on the wind, the way laughter at night keeps darker thoughts at bay. I learned that there's a reason campfires have always been communal things. Months passed, then a year. The fear dulled, but it never fully left. It sat quietly like a scar that only aches when the weather changes. Sometimes, driving through wooded stretches, I'd catch myself glancing at gaps between trees, half expecting them to rearrange themselves when I wasn't looking. The final reminder came when I least expected it. I was camped in western North Carolina, a popular site this time, full hookups and numbered lots, families nearby, kids riding bikes in lazy loops. On my second night there, an older man stopped by my site while I was packing away gear. He had the look of someone who'd lived his life outdoors, creased skin, like steady eyes, movements economical and unhurried. "Where you headed next?" he asked. "Not sure," I said. "Just following the road." He nodded, then glanced toward the trees lining the edge of the campground. His gaze lingered a beat too long. "Don't do that alone up here," he said quietly. "Not in the deep places." I felt my chest tighten. "You hear things sometimes," he went on, voice calm, conversational. "People think the mountains are empty. They're not. Never have been." I wanted to ask him more, to tell him everything. But something in his expression told me he already knew enough, and that some stories don't benefit from being dragged into daylight. That night, lying in my new RV, surrounded by the distant murmur of other campers, I finally understood the lesson Appalachia had carved into me. Fear isn't always a warning of danger. Sometimes it's recognition. Those mountains didn't chase me. They didn't attack me. They simply revealed how thin the line is between confidence and arrogance, between solitude and isolation. They showed me that the land remembers who listens and who doesn't. I still believe in the beauty of RV camping. I still believe in the healing power of open roads and quiet nights under wide skies. But I also believe this. There are places in this country where the dark isn't empty, where silence isn't neutral, and where being alone isn't brave. It's reckless. If you ever find yourself drawn to remote Appalachia, feeling that pull towards somewhere untouched and forgotten, listen carefully to what your instincts are telling you. Pay attention to the way the air feels too still, the way sounds repeat themselves a little too perfectly, the way your name seems closer than it should be. Because the mountains don't need to hurt you to teach you something. Sometimes all they have to do is let you know they're aware you're there. And once you understand that, you'll never camp the same way again. I learned the hard way that silence in the mountains isn't empty. It's crowded with things waiting for you to notice them. My name is Caleb Mercer. I was 38 years old when this happened, old enough to trust my experience, young enough to still believe I could outdrive bad luck. I'd been RV camping alone for years by then, zigzagging across the United States in a weathered Volkswagen camper I rebuilt myself. Engine tuned by my own hands, cabinets sanded smooth with weekends of patience. That van wasn't just transport, it was proof I could be self-reliant, that I didn't need anyone watching my back. At least that's what I told myself when I pointed the nose of that VW toward the remote spine of Appalachia. I chose that region because it looked untouched on the map. No big campgrounds, no glossy brochures, just narrow roads folding into darker green the farther you went. Locals warned me at a gas station outside a fading coal town, two men who went quiet when I told them where I planned to camp. One finally said, almost apologetically, "People get turned around up there. Not lost, just turned around." I laughed it off, paid for my coffee, and drove on. I told myself fear thrives on superstition, and superstition thrives where cell service dies. The campground wasn't really a campground, just a clearing carved out near a creek, no ranger station, no numbered sites. The air smelled damp and metallic, like wet pennies and old leaves. It was late afternoon, that hour when the sun feels tired and the shadows stretch like they're waking up. I parked the van where the ground leveled out, stepped outside, and listened. No birds, no wind, just the creek muttering to itself somewhere downslope. It felt less like arriving somewhere and more like being noticed. I told myself that was just the quiet playing tricks on me. Denial has a comforting rhythm. You repeat it until it sounds like truth. That first evening passed without incident. I cooked a simple meal, wiped down the counter, locked the doors out of habit. As darkness settled, the temperature dropped faster than expected. Cold pressed in through the metal walls of the van, a slow squeeze that made everything feel smaller. I crawled into the bunk, listening to the creak and the occasional pop of cooling engine parts, and tried to sleep. That's when I heard the knock. It wasn't loud. It wasn't urgent. Just a single deliberate tap against the side panel of the van, metal on something solid. I held my breath, counting the seconds afterward, waiting for the sound to explain itself. Nothing followed, no footsteps, no voice. I told myself it was a branch, maybe something rolling downhill. Appalachia is full of explanations if you want them badly enough. Then it happened again. Same spot, same pressure. As if whoever or whatever was there knew exactly how hard to knock without denting the metal. My chest tightened. I stayed still, listening past my own pulse. The creek kept muttering. Somewhere far off, something screamed. Not an animal sound I recognized, not quite human either. It rose and cut off abruptly, like a radio losing signal. I lay there until my muscles cramped, until the silence returned so completely it felt staged. By morning, exhaustion had sanded the edge off my fear. Sunlight filtered through the trees, making everything look harmless again. I brewed coffee outside, watching steam curl into the cool air. That's when I noticed the footprints. They circled the van. barefoot. Too large to be a child's, too narrow to belong to the men I'd seen back in town. The dirt was pressed deep, toes splayed slightly, like whoever made them stood there for a long time, studying. I felt a flicker of anger at myself for not leaving immediately. Pride is a heavy thing to drag around, and I'd brought plenty of it with me. I decided to stay one more night. I told myself I needed answers, that running would turn fear into a habit. That was the rationalization talking, the same voice that tells you not to listen to your instincts because instincts don't have evidence. That afternoon, a local man appeared on the trail leading into the clearing. He looked to be in his late 50s, beard gray and uneven, eyes set deep under a brimless cap. He didn't smile, didn't introduce himself, just stared at the van and then at me, like he was checking something off a list. "You alone?" he asked. I nodded. He shifted his weight, boots grinding softly into the dirt. "This ain't a good place for that." I asked him about the footprints. His eyes flicked toward the trees, then back to me. "They come down from higher up sometimes, not folks you want knocking on your door." He said it casually, like he was talking about weather. Then he turned and walked back down the trail without another word. That night, the forest felt closer. Sounds carried wrong, too clear, too directed. I shut off the lights inside the van early, sitting in the dark with my hands wrapped around a flashlight I didn't want to turn on. Smells drifted in through the vents, something sour, something animal. I told myself it was the creek stirring up rot. I told myself a lot of things. The knock came again. This time 3 taps. Slow. Patient. Followed by the faintest drag along the metal, like fingers tracing the seam. Panic climbed my spine, cold and electric. I locked the doors again, even though they already were, checked the windows, every movement loud in my own ears. Outside, I heard breathing. Not close enough to see, close enough to imagine. I shouted, told whoever it was to leave. My voice sounded thin, unfamiliar. The breathing stopped, then footsteps retreated. Not running, not hurried, just satisfied. Sadn't sleep at all. When dawn came, it felt like escape. I packed fast, hands shaking, adrenaline making every task clumsy. As I started the engine, something hit the windshield hard enough to crack it. A rock, thrown from somewhere I couldn't see. That was the moment fear broke through, denial completely. I didn't look back as I drove out, tires spinning on loose gravel, heart pounding louder than the engine. I didn't stop until I hit a main road. Even then, I kept driving, the mountains receding in the mirrors like they were watching me go. It took weeks before the tension left my body, months before I could sleep through the night without listening for knocks that weren't there. The lesson didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, like those sounds in the dark. I learned that some places don't care how prepared you are, how experienced you think you've become. I learned that solitude isn't the same as safety, and that ignoring your instincts doesn't make you brave. It makes you available. I still camp. I still love the road. But I don't camp alone in places where the map goes quiet and the locals won't meet your eyes. Because in remote Appalachia, the land remembers every sound you make, and sometimes it answers back. I thought leaving Appalachia would end it. That distance alone would cauterize whatever had latched onto me in those woods. But fear doesn't respect geography, and memory doesn't care about state lines. For weeks after I got back, I slept in fragments. Every creak of the van settling at night snapped me awake. Every unexpected knock, someone closing a car door nearby, a neighbor tapping on a fence, sent my heart racing like I was back in that clearing, counting taps and waiting for breathing I couldn't see. I kept telling myself it was just nerves, the residue of a bad trip. But nerves fade. This didn't. It burrowed. I replaced the cracked windshield, scrubbed the interior until my hands smelled like disinfectant instead of pine and metal, even rearranged the cabinets, as if changing the van's insides might shake loose whatever memory had soaked into the walls. Still, some nights, when the temperature dropped fast and the air went still, I swore I could smell that sour animal note again, wet fur and iron, and my chest would tighten before I could reason it away. I didn't talk about it to anyone. That was my other mistake. Silence can feel like control, but it's really just isolation wearing a smarter coat. 3 months later, I found myself driving again, heading west this time, telling myself I needed to reclaim the road. I stuck to busier campgrounds at first, places with numbered sites and ranger stations and families grilling hot dogs under string lights. It helped. The fear dulled, became background noise instead of a scream. That's when I started thinking maybe Appalachia had been a singular anomaly, a perfect storm of remoteness, fatigue, and my own stubborn pride. That rationalization almost got me killed. It happened at a small campground in eastern Kentucky, not nearly as remote as the first place, but close enough to the mountains that the land still felt folded inward. I arrived just before dusk. There were other campers around, but spaced far enough apart that conversations dissolved into the trees. I picked a site near the edge, old habits pulling me toward solitude even when I pretended otherwise. That night, as I lay in the bunk, I heard it again. Not a knock this time. A scrape. Slow. Methodical. Along the lower panel near the back wheel. Every muscle in my body went rigid. My mind raced, cataloging possibilities. Raccoon, stray dog, someone stumbling drunk. But my instincts cut through them with brutal clarity. This wasn't curious. It was deliberate. The sound paused, then resumed, tracing the same line like someone memorizing the shape of the van. I grabbed the flashlight, thumb hovering over the switch. I didn't want to see. Seeing would make it real in a way memory still hadn't. The scrape stopped, silence swelled, thick and oppressive. Then came the smell, stronger than before, close. Panic surged. I turned on the flashlight and shouted, the beam slashing across the interior, my voice cracking as it spilled out of me. Outside, something moved, fast. I heard footsteps retreat into the trees, branches snapping under hurried weight. I stayed frozen for a long time after that, heart hammering, flashlight clenched like a lifeline. In the morning, there were marks along the panel. Not scratches from an animal. Too even, too intentional. 5 parallel lines, shallow but unmistakable. Finger width. I packed up without breakfast, hands trembling so badly I dropped my keys twice. That was the moment denial finally lost its grip. This wasn't a single place. It wasn't just Appalachia as a region or one cursed clearing tucked into the woods. It was something about being alone, about presenting yourself as an unguarded boundary in places where the rules feel older than roads and signs. I started asking questions after that, quietly, carefully, at diners, at repair shops, anywhere locals lingered. Most people laughed it off or changed the subject. A few got tense, eyes darting like they were checking who might be listening. One woman, probably in her 70s, leaned across the counter and told me, "The mountains don't like being watched. They especially don't like it when you think you're invisible." I don't know if she meant it literally. I don't know if it matters. What I do know is this: fear changes you. It strips away the stories you tell yourself about control and replaces them with smaller, sharper truths. I learned to camp differently after that, not just with more people around, but with more humility. I stopped chasing the most remote spots like they were trophies. I trusted the unease when it crept in, even when I couldn't explain it, especially then. And still, some nights when I'm parked somewhere quiet and the world settles into that deep listening stillness, I feel it again. That sense of being evaluated, of standing out against a darkness that knows exactly where you are. I remind myself to breathe, to check the locks, to keep the light off and the senses sharp. Because the scariest lesson Appalachia taught me wasn't that something was out there. It was that I'd ignored the part of myself that knew better. And if you ever find yourself alone in a place where the silence feels deliberate, where the sounds repeat just enough to feel intentional, don't wait for proof. Don't wait for a knock. Leave while you still think you're choosing to go. Some things don't chase you. They just wait. I tried to convince myself that awareness was enough, that once you name a fear, it loses its teeth. But some lessons don't fade just because you've learned them. They settle in. They wait for quiet moments. A year passed. I kept moving. Arizona deserts, Utah red rock, coastal Oregon where the ocean never lets silence get too heavy. I told myself I'd outpaced whatever had followed me out of Appalachia. Life almost felt normal again. Almost. Then work pulled me east. A short contract. Good money. I promised myself I wouldn't drift toward the mountains. I'd stay in well-lit places, campgrounds with reservation kiosks and posted rules, places where the land felt managed, tamed. That promise held until a detour sign sent me down a narrow highway curling through West Virginia hills, the kind of road that feels like it's leading you backward in time. It was late when I realized how far I'd gone. Cell service vanished. The sky darkened fast, clouds swallowing the moon. I saw a small sign, brown peeling, indicating a campground a mile ahead. I hesitated, hand tight on the wheel. Every instinct screamed to keep driving, but fatigue argued back. I told myself one night wouldn't hurt. I told myself I was being paranoid. The campground was empty. No cars, no glow of lanterns, just a wide clearing ringed by trees that leaned inward like they were listening. I parked near the entrance, ready to leave at the first sign of trouble. The air felt wrong immediately. Too still, too heavy. Even the insects were quiet. My skin prickled as if the temperature had dropped 10 degrees the moment I stepped out of the van. I didn't cook, didn't set up anything that would make staying feel intentional. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine off, keys in my lap, listening. Minutes stretched. Nothing happened. That was worse than noise. When the sound finally came, it wasn't outside. It was underneath. A dull thud reverberated through the floor directly below my feet. Then another. Slow. Testing. I felt the vibration travel up my legs into my spine. Panic surged so fast it blurred my vision. I fumbled for the keys, hands slick with sweat, heart hammering loud enough to drown out thought. Before I could turn the ignition, the van rocked. Not hard, just enough to be unmistakable. I screamed then, no words, just sound. The engine roared to life as something slammed against the side panel, harder this time, metal groaning in protest. I hit the gas without looking back, gravel spraying, branches scraping the paint as I tore out of the clearing. In the rearview mirror, I saw movement at the tree line, shapes pulling back into shadow, unhurried, as if they knew I'd be thinking about them for a long time. I drove until dawn. I didn't stop at rest areas, didn't pull over to breathe. When the sun finally rose, burning off the mist and revealing normal roads and normal signs, I pulled into a crowded truck stop and sat there shaking, surrounded by noise and people and fluorescent light. Safety felt unreal, like a story someone else had told me. That was the last night I camped alone. Not because I was weak, not because I was afraid of the dark, but because I finally understood the difference between solitude and vulnerability. There are places in this country, beautiful ancient places, where being alone isn't peaceful. It's provocative, where the land doesn't just observe you, but measures you, weighs you against its own rules. I still think about the men at the gas station, the way their voices dropped, the way the old woman leaned in close. I think about the footprints, the scrapes, the knocks that never asked permission. I think about how many times I ignored my instincts because I didn't want fear to dictate my choices. But fear isn't always a cage. Sometimes it's a warning flare. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. Respect the silence. Respect the unease. When the environment presses in, when the sounds repeat just enough to feel intentional, don't argue with yourself. Don't wait for confirmation. Leave early. Leave messy. Leave with your pride bruised but your body intact, because the mountains don't need you to believe in them. They were there long before your RV, your maps, your confidence, and they will still be there long after the road forgets your name. The first thing that went wrong wasn't the sound. It was the silence that arrived too suddenly, like the woods had inhaled and decided not to exhale again. My name is Caleb Mercer. I was 36 that fall, old enough to know better and young enough to still believe solitude could scrub a man clean. I grew up in western Pennsylvania, the kind of place where tree lines feel familiar and back roads don't scare you, and I'd been RV camping for more than a decade by then. I wasn't reckless. I wasn't chasing adrenaline. I was chasing quiet. That was the lie I told myself when I pointed my old Volkswagen Westphalia south toward a stretch of Appalachia so remote it didn't bother showing up clearly on most campground maps. The van had a personality. Anyone who's driven a vintage VW knows that. The engine ticked like it was thinking out loud, the cabinets sighed when you opened them, and the sliding door never shut without a firm reminder. I trusted it more than most people. That should have been the first red flag, too. I chose the site because it was labeled primitive. No hookups, no office, no rangers driving loops at night, just a narrow gravel road that peeled off the highway and sank into trees that looked older than names. Locals at a gas station 20 miles back had gone quiet when I mentioned where I was headed. One guy, gray beard, coal dust still under his nails, told me I wouldn't get a signal out there. Another asked if I was meeting someone. When I said no, he frowned like I told him I planned to swim alone at night. I laughed it off. That's what denial sounds like when it wears a smile. By the time I reached the clearing, daylight had already begun to thin, stretching shadows like fingers across the ground. The campsite wasn't much more than a flattened oval of dirt, ringed by trees that leaned inward just enough to feel intentional. No picnic table, no fire ring, just space. I parked the van so the rear doors faced the woods, because something in me didn't like the idea of sleeping with my back to open darkness. Even then, I told myself it was just habit. The air smelled damp and metallic, like rain that had soaked into stone and never quite left. When I stepped out, the temperature felt wrong, cooler than it should have been for early October, cold enough to tighten the skin on my arms. Sound carried strangely there. A footstep echoed too long. A bird call stretched until it didn't sound like a bird anymore. I noticed it, cataloged it, then did what I always did when something didn't fit. I rationalized it away. I cooked dinner as the light drained out of the sky. Simple stuff. Beans, bread, a can of chili warmed on the stove. The van rocked slightly as I moved, and for a moment it felt like floating, like the ground itself wasn't solid anymore. That's when the smell shifted. The clean dampness turned sour, almost sweet, like rot hidden under leaves. It made my stomach tighten in a way hunger never does. I ate anyway. Night fell fast. Appalachia doesn't ease into darkness. It drops it on you like a curtain. I shut the van up, latched the door, and sat on the bench seat with a headlamp on low, reading a dog-eared paperback I'd brought along. I told myself the quiet was the whole point. I told myself the unease was just my nerves adjusting to isolation. Then came the first knock. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. Just a single deliberate tap against the metal skin of the van somewhere near the rear panel. I froze with my finger holding the page. I waited for the follow-up sound my brain insisted would come. A branch brushing the side, a pine cone falling, something explainable. Nothing did. I listened so hard my ears began to ring. The forest didn't answer. No insects, no wind, just the low tick of the engine cooling like a clock counting something down. After a long minute, I exhaled and laughed under my breath, annoyed at myself. Old van, contracting metal. That's all. I turned the page. The second knock came from the opposite side. That one was closer to the sliding door, higher up, like someone had reached out at shoulder height. The rhythm was wrong for an animal. Too measured. Too patient. I felt heat bloom behind my eyes, that flush of adrenaline that arrives before reason can catch up. I stood slowly, every movement exaggerated, and leaned toward the window without actually looking out. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding thin even to me. The word disappeared into the trees and didn't come back. I told myself that if someone was out there, they'd answer. Campers shout, they apologize, they explain. Silence is what happens when there's no one to hear you, or when whoever's listening doesn't want to speak. I killed the headlamp and waited. Minutes passed. My heart thudded hard enough to feel in my throat. When nothing else happened, relief came in a rush so strong it left me shaky. I crawled into the sleeping area, pulled the curtains tight, and lay there staring at fabric patterns, convincing myself the fear would drain out if I ignored it. Sometime later, I never checked the clock, I woke to the sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, circling. Each step pressed into the dirt with a soft crunch, then lifted, paused, and moved again. I could track the path by sound alone, rear doors, driver's side, front, passenger side. A perfect loop. My mouth went dry. I held my breath, afraid even that small sound might be an invitation. The steps stopped right outside the sliding door. I waited for the knock that didn't come. Instead, I smelled it again. That sweet rot, stronger now, seeping through seams I hadn't known were there. My skin prickled, every instinct screaming that something about this was wrong in a way logic couldn't fix. I thought about the locals' faces, the way they'd looked at me like I was already gone. I thought about how easy it would be to start the engine, to drive blind and fast until the trees thinned. I didn't move. That was my mistake. The handle of the sliding door shifted, just slightly, testing resistance. Not yanked, not rattled, just turned enough to confirm it was locked. Whoever or whatever was out there let it fall back into place with care, like they didn't want to wake someone sleeping inside. A soft sound followed, almost a sigh, almost a word. I curled into myself, heart slamming, mind scrambling for explanations that no longer fit. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't a lost camper. This was intention, wrapped in patience, and it knew I was alone. The footsteps moved away again, slower this time, dragging slightly as if the ground resisted each step. They faded into the trees, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than any noise. I lay there long after, muscles locked, eyes burning, waiting for something, anything to break the stillness. When morning finally came, it didn't feel like relief. It felt like permission had been revoked. And as I pushed myself upright, stiff and exhausted, I noticed something outside the rear window that made my blood run cold, because whatever had circled my van in the dark had left a mark, and it hadn't finished with me yet. I stared at it through the fogged glass until my eyes started to ache, hoping the shape would rearrange itself into something harmless if I just waited long enough. It didn't. Pressed into the dirt behind the van were footprints, not boot prints, not bare feet either, but something in between. Too long, too narrow. The heel impressions were shallow, like whoever made them didn't put their weight down all the way, like they were testing the ground instead of walking on it. They circled the van in the same careful loop I had heard in the night, overlapping in places, pausing near the doors, lingering longest by the sliding one. There were no other tracks, no sign of where they'd come from, no sign of where they'd gone. I stepped out slowly, the cold biting through my boots. Morning light filtered down in pale shafts, but it didn't warm anything. The forest looked the same as it had the night before, and somehow that made it worse. No obvious threat. No visible danger, just trees standing where trees had always stood, dirt pretending it hadn't been disturbed. I walked the perimeter once, keeping my keys clenched in my fist like a talisman. The smell was still there, faint but unmistakable, strongest near the rear doors. I crouched and touched the ground. The soil was cold and damp, but there were no drag marks, no scuffs. Whoever had been there moved carefully, intentionally. I told myself to leave. That voice was clear now, louder than it had been all night. Pack up, drive out. Pride argued back, told me I was letting shadows bully me, that I'd driven hours for this spot and wasn't about to let nerves chase me off at sunrise. That internal fight lasted longer than it should have, and when I finally straightened up, decision made, it was the wrong one. I stayed. I spent the morning doing busy work, the kind you do when you don't want to think. Checked fluids, reorganized cabinets, took notes in a little spiral notebook I used to log mileage and campsite details. I didn't write about the footprints. I didn't write about the knocks. Putting them into words felt like inviting them to become permanent. By noon, the forest had found its voice again. Insects buzzed, birds called from high branches. The normalcy almost convinced me I'd imagined the rest. Almost. But every now and then I'd hear something that didn't fit. A call that sounded too close, then too far, like distance itself was bending. A rustle that moved against the wind instead of with it. In the afternoon, I took a short walk down the trail that led away from the clearing. I told myself it was to stretch my legs. Really, I wanted proof that the world extended beyond that oval of dirt, that the woods weren't closing in. The trail was narrow, barely maintained, and after a few hundred yards, it dipped into a hollow where the temperature dropped sharply. My breath fogged in front of me. The smell hit again, stronger here, pooled in the low ground. I stopped when I saw the ribbons. Strips of faded fabric were tied to branches on either side of the trail, some so old they'd frayed into threads, others newer, colors still holding. Red, blue, yellow. They twisted gently in the breeze, marking something I couldn't see beyond the bend. My skin crawled. I didn't touch them. I didn't go any farther. I turned around and walked back, every instinct telling me I'd already gone too far. The rest of the day dragged. Clouds thickened overhead, dimming the light early. By the time evening settled in, unease had become a constant companion, sitting heavy in my chest. I ate a cold dinner, appetite gone, and locked myself inside the van again before full dark. I told myself I'd leave at first light. That was the compromise I made with my fear. Night came quieter than the one before. No knocks, no footsteps. The silence felt watchful, like something holding still on purpose. I lay awake listening to my own breathing, counting seconds, waiting for the other shoe to drop. When it did, it wasn't sound that woke me. It was movement. The van rocked gently side to side like someone had leaned against it and shifted their weight. I snapped upright, heart in my throat, hand clamping over my mouth. The rocking stopped. I waited, muscles screaming with tension. After a long moment, it started again, subtle, almost curious. Then came the scratching. Not frantic, not aggressive, just slow, deliberate lines dragged along the metal near the rear doors. Nails? Something harder? I couldn't tell. Each pass raised goosebumps along my arms. I tasted bile and copper, fear sharp enough to feel like it might split me open. "Go away," I whispered, hating the plea in my own voice. The scratching paused. A shape passed in front of the rear window, blotting out the faint starlight. Too tall, too thin. It leaned close enough that I could see condensation bloom on the glass from its breath. The smell flooded in, thick and sweet, making my eyes water. I don't know why I did it. Maybe some stubborn, self-destructive part of me needed confirmation. I reached out and pulled the curtain back an inch. I wish I hadn't. What stared in wasn't a face in any way I recognized. The features were wrong, set too far apart, stretched like they'd been learned instead of grown. The eyes reflected light dully, not with the sharp glint of an animal, but flat, like glass left out too long. Its mouth opened slightly, lips peeling back as if tasting the air. It smiled. Not with warmth, not with malice either, with something closer to recognition. I slammed the curtain shut and scrambled for the front seats, keys shaking in my hand. The rocking intensified, the van swaying as if pushed from both sides now. Scratching turned to knocking, soft at first, then louder, more insistent, echoing through the thin walls. I shoved the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine coughed once, then died. Panic surged, hot and blinding. I tried again. Nothing. Outside, the knocking stopped. A new sound took its place. Footsteps. More than one. They moved in that same careful circle, overlapping, crowding close. Shadows slid across the windshield. I felt surrounded, boxed in by metal and fear, my earlier confidence now a bitter joke. I slammed the steering wheel, muttering prayers I didn't believe in. On the third try, the engine caught. The roar felt deafening in the quiet woods. I didn't hesitate. I threw the van into gear and gunned it, headlights cutting wild paths through trees as I tore down the gravel road. Something ran alongside for a few seconds, too fast, keeping pace, before dropping back into darkness. I didn't slow until pavement appeared under my tires and cell service flickered back to life. I pulled over at a turnout miles away and sat there shaking, forehead pressed to the wheel, waiting for my heart to calm. I never went back to that campsite. I never drove that stretch of Appalachia again. But leaving didn't mean escaping. because even now, years later, when I'm alone in a quiet place, I sometimes catch that same sweet rot on the air. And I know with a certainty that chills me deeper than fear ever could, that whatever learned my shape in those woods is very patient. I thought distance would bleach it out of me, that miles of highway and years of routine would sand the edges off what happened in those woods. But fear doesn't obey geography, and memory doesn't need permission to surface. I sold the Westphalia 6 months later, told the buyer it was time for something newer, safer. I didn't mention how the smell lingered no matter how many times I scrubbed the interior, how on certain mornings the curtains would be damp when there'd been no rain, no humidity to explain it. I didn't mention the faint scratches that reappeared along the rear panel after long drives, thin lines I'd swear hadn't been there before. Life filled in around the gap where that trip sat. Work, friends, other campsites, busy ones, well-lit ones, places where voices carried and people stayed up too late telling stories by the fire. I never camped alone again. That wasn't fear. That was data. A hard-earned correction to a belief I'd carried too long, that solitude was always safe if you were experienced enough. Still, Appalachia followed me. Sometimes it came in dreams. I'd be back in the clearing, the trees leaning closer than before, the ground breathing under my feet. I'd hear the knock, not on metal but on bone, and wake with my heart racing, convinced for a split second that something stood just outside my bedroom door, listening. Other times it was smaller, quieter. I'd catch myself cataloging exits in places I never used to. I'd notice smells first, then sounds, then the absence of both. I stopped dismissing that internal tightening as anxiety. I started treating it like a conversation, one I'd ignored too often before. It took a long time to understand that what happened out there wasn't just about fear. It was about arrogance, about believing that experience made me immune, that knowledge of routes and rigs and routines meant I could predict every variable. Appalachia taught me otherwise. It reminded me that there are places shaped by stories older than mine, rhythms that don't care how prepared you think you are. I went back to camping eventually, carefully, with others. I learned to read spaces the way you read people, not just for what they show you, but for what they withhold. I stopped pushing past unease just to prove I could. I learned that leaving isn't failure when the alternative is staying somewhere that doesn't want you there. Every now and then, someone asks me why I won't camp solo anymore, why I won't take the road less traveled if it means being truly alone. I tell them a version that sounds reasonable. I talk about safety, about animals, about mechanical breakdowns and bad luck. I don't tell them about the smile at the window, about footprints that didn't lead anywhere, about how the forest felt like it was paying attention. Because some lessons aren't meant to be shared lightly. Some are meant to be carried, heavy and quiet, as a reminder. If you ever find yourself deep in those mountains, parked where the map grows vague and the silence feels intentional, pay attention to what your body tells you before your mind catches up. Listen when the woods go still. Trust the discomfort that doesn't announce itself loudly. And if something knocks, soft, patient, like it knows you're listening, don't wait to find out why. Leave. Because there are places in Appalachia where being alone isn't just risky, it's an invitation. The first thud didn't sound like an accident. It sounded like intention. It came from somewhere beyond the beam of my headlamp, deep in the redwood forest, heavy enough that the ground under my boots answered back with a faint tremor. I remember standing there, frozen, my breath fogging the cold March air, telling myself it was nothing, telling myself that forests make noises, that big trees fall, that animals move at night. I had driven nearly 8 hours north to get here, and I wasn't about to let my imagination ruin what was supposed to be a reset. My name is Marcus Hale. I was 39 years old that spring, freshly divorced, exhausted in a way sleep couldn't touch. I lived most of my life in Sacramento working logistics for a shipping company surrounded by numbers, deadlines, and screens. Camping had always been my way out. specifically RV camping, where I could carry just enough comfort to feel safe while still being close enough to the wild to feel small again. I drove a vintage Volkswagen Westphalia, beige with rust freckles along the seams, a vehicle I trusted more than most people. I'd rebuilt half of it myself. The engine had a familiar cough when it turned over, like an old friend clearing its throat before speaking. I knew every sound it made. That night, in the Redwood Forest RV camp just outside Prairie Creek, California, I learned what it sounded like when something else decided to speak back. The campground was quiet when I arrived just before dusk. Too quiet. Only 3 other RVs were scattered across the loops, their owners nowhere in sight. The host booth was empty, a clipboard hanging from a nail with no name written on it. I told myself it was off-season, early spring, nothing unusual. The redwoods towered overhead, ancient and indifferent, their trunks so wide they felt less like trees and more like walls. The light thinned fast under their canopy, evening dropping like a curtain instead of a fade. I picked a site close to the edge of the forest, rather than the open clearing. I always did. Something about having my back to the trees made me feel protected, even though logic said the opposite. I leveled the van, cut the engine, and sat there for a moment with my hands still on the wheel, listening. Wind whispered high above, but down at ground level, everything felt held, like the forest was pausing, waiting to see what I'd do. I cooked a simple dinner, canned chili heated on the propane stove, eaten straight from the pot. The smell lingered longer than it should have, thick and metallic, mixing with damp earth and old bark. I remember thinking how the air felt heavier than usual, like it pressed against my chest instead of filling it. By the time full darkness settled in, I had convinced myself I was just tired. That's when the first thud hit. It came from somewhere off to the right of my sight, deep enough that I couldn't pinpoint it. Not a crack like a branch snapping, not a rustle, a blunt, solid impact. Thoom. Followed by silence so complete it rang in my ears. I stood outside the van, headlamp cutting a narrow cone through the dark, my heart doing that irritating thing where it sped up before I could tell it not to. Probably a falling branch, I muttered out loud as if the forest needed reassurance. I waited. Nothing followed. No second sound. No echo. I went back inside and slid the door shut harder than necessary. For the next hour I tried to read, but the words wouldn't stick. Every small sound, the tick of cooling metal, the faint creak of the van settling felt amplified. Around 10 o'clock, another thud came, closer this time. Strong enough that the van shuddered slightly, as if the ground itself had shifted. This one didn't sound like it came from above. It sounded horizontal, like something moving through the forest, step by deliberate step. I turned off the book light and sat in the dark, listening. My brain ran through explanations faster than I could stop it. Elk, black bear, fallen log rolling downhill, each theory felt thinner than the last. And I'd camped around wildlife before. Animals moved with rhythm, with noise layered on noise. This was singular, isolated, purposeful. A third thud followed, then a fourth, each one separated by long, patient pauses. Whatever it wasn't wandering. It was approaching. I cracked the window an inch, just enough to let sound in. The smell hit me first. Something sour, almost coppery, layered over the damp rot of the forest floor. I didn't recognize it, and that bothered me more than the noise. The redwoods blocked the moonlight completely, turning the campground into a bowl of ink. My headlamp battery flickered when I turned it back on, the beam weaker now, trembling slightly. Another thud landed so close I felt it through the soles of my feet. My instincts screamed at me to lock everything, to hide, but another part of me, the stubborn, rational part, refused to panic without proof. I'd spent years ignoring my instincts in my personal life, convincing myself things were fine until they weren't. I wasn't about to start projecting ghosts onto trees, so I did something stupid. I slid the door open and stepped out. The cold wrapped around me immediately, sharper now, like the temperature had dropped all at once. My breath came out fast, loud in the quiet. I swept the headlamp beam across the tree line, The light swallowed bark and shadow, but showed nothing moving. No eye shine, no shifting branches, just stillness so intense it felt staged. Then came a sound I hadn't expected, a low exhale, not loud, not aggressive, but close enough that my skin prickled. It wasn't an animal huff. It had shape to it, like breath controlled by a chest too large to be hurried. I backed up slowly, never turning my back on the darkness. The beam of my lamp caught something disturbed on the ground near the edge of my sight. Footprints, maybe, but too deep. The soil pressed down in wide impressions that didn't match any track I knew. They led not toward me, but around me, as if whatever made them was circling. The smell grew stronger. That's when the knocking started. Not on the van, on the trees. A heavy, dull impact against bark, followed by a pause, then another, closer. The sound traveled through the wood, vibrating faintly in my teeth. I realized with a sick twist of clarity that the thuds weren't footsteps at all. They were strikes. Something testing the forest the way a person tests walls in the dark, learning the space by touch. Panic crept in, not sudden, but thick and suffocating. My mind raced through options. Drive away? I'd have to turn the ignition, make noise, blind myself with headlights pointed straight into the trees. Run into what? I felt stupid for being alone, stupid for choosing this site, stupid for thinking solitude was safe. Another knock landed, so close the bark flakes drifted down in my headlamp beam. I retreated into the van and slammed the door, locking it with shaking hands. The interior felt impossibly small now, the thin metal walls a joke against whatever mass was moving outside. I sat on the bench seat, keys in my hand, listening as the knocks continued, methodical, unhurried, working their way around my camp. Something massive was mapping me in the dark, and I knew with a certainty that cut through every excuse I'd made so far that whatever was out there wasn't lost. It was curious. The knocking stopped all at once, not fading, not drifting away, just gone like a hand lifted from a drum. The silence that followed felt heavier than the noise ever had, thick enough that I could hear my own pulse thudding in my ears, matching a rhythm I didn't want to acknowledge. I stayed frozen on the bench seat, keys clenched so hard in my fist that the metal bit into my palm. I told myself to count my breaths, to slow down, but my lungs refused cooperation, pulling in short, shallow gas that fogged the windshield from the inside. Then something brushed the side of the van. Not a scrape, not a hit. A drag, slow, deliberate, like fingers or knuckles moving along the thin aluminum skin. The sound traveled from the rear quarter panel toward the sliding door, a faint rasp that raised goosebumps along my arms. The Westphalia creaked in response, a tired old sound I'd heard 1,000 times before in windstorms. But this was different. This wasn't pressure from weather. This was contact. I squeezed my eyes shut for a second, as if that could make it less real. When I opened them, the interior felt darker, the shadows deeper, pressing in. The smell seeped through the cracked window again, stronger now, clinging to the back of my throat. My mind kept circling the same useless thought. It knows I'm here. Not in a general sense, not like an animal stumbling into a campsite, but specifically, deliberately aware. Another brush along the van, higher this time, near the window frame. The glass flexed slightly, letting out a tiny, panicked creak. I imagined the shape of whatever was outside without wanting to. Height, mass, the way it moved with patience instead of hunger. Predators rushed. This thing took its time. I couldn't stay like that. The fear was turning inward, tightening, threatening to lock me in place until something else decided the ending. My thumb found the key fob by muscle memory, hovering over the panic button. I stopped myself. Noise would change the situation, and I didn't know how. I needed control, even if it was an illusion. The engine turned over on the second try, the familiar cough sounding obscenely loud in the quiet forest. The headlights flared to life, blasting white light straight into the trees. For half a second, I thought I saw movement, a shadow pulling back just beyond the beam, but it was gone before my brain could pin it down. The knocking didn't resume. The dragging stopped. I didn't put the van in gear right away. I sat there with the engine idling, scanning left and right, my foot hovering over the brake. The forest absorbed the light without giving anything back. No eyes, no shapes, just trunks and darkness stacked so deep it felt endless. I told myself this was my chance. Leave now, don't think, don't wait. As I shifted into reverse, something hit the back of the van. The impact was violent enough to throw me forward against the steering wheel, the seatbelt biting into my shoulder. The sound was a deep, resonant boom that rang through the chassis, followed by the unmistakable shudder of weight shifting away. Not a charge, not an attack meant to break in. A warning, a demonstration. Panic surged fully then, hot and overwhelming. I slammed the van into drive and floored it, tires spinning briefly on damp soil before catching. The Westie lurched forward, engine whining in protest as I barreled down the narrow campground road, branches whipping past inches from the mirrors. I didn't slow for turns. I didn't look back. The road curved sharply ahead, and as my headlights swept across the bend, they caught something standing just off the shoulder. Tall, impossibly broad, its outline broken by hanging moss and shadow. I saw it for less than a second, but it was enough. Too upright, too still, watching. I screamed without realizing it. A raw sound ripped out of my chest and swerved hard, barely keeping the van on the road. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. The forest swallowed it again as soon as the light passed. I didn't stop driving until the trees thinned and the faint glow of a highway sign appeared through the windshield. Only then did I pull over, hands shaking so badly I had to grip the wheel with both palms just to stay upright. I sat there for a long time, engine still running, afraid that if I turned it off, the silence would bring everything rushing back. Eventually, exhaustion won. I drove the rest of the night, stopping only when dawn washed the sky in pale gray. I parked at a crowded rest area, surrounded by semis and commuters, and slept in fits, jerking awake at every unfamiliar sound. When I finally checked the back of the van in full daylight, my stomach dropped. The rear panel was dented inward, not crushed, but pressed like soft clay. Long streaks scored the paint, not scratches exactly, more like pressure marks, as if something blunt and wide had leaned its weight there. No fur, no blood, just evidence without explanation. I reported the incident to a ranger later that morning, my voice steadier than I felt. He listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When I finished, he nodded slowly and told me that sometimes trees fell in the night, sometimes bears got curious, sometimes fear filled in gaps the dark left behind. He didn't ask to see the van. I didn't push. I thanked him and left. For weeks afterward, the sound followed me, the memory of those thuds echoing in quiet rooms, in the hollow moments just before sleep. I found myself listening too closely everywhere, reading intention into random noises. The forest had rewired something in me, tuned my instincts to a frequency I couldn't turn off, but it also taught me something I'd ignored for years. Denial is louder than fear, and far more dangerous. That night in the redwoods, my instincts spoke early and clearly, and I argued with them until it nearly cost me more than a ruined trip. The wild doesn't owe us explanations or comfort. It only offers warnings, subtle at first, and then not at all. I still camp. I still drive the Westphalia, dense and all, but I choose my sights differently now. I listen harder, and when the forest goes quiet in a way that feels wrong, I don't wait for proof anymore. Because some things don't chase you. They just watch. Patient in the dark, letting you decide how the story ends. I thought leaving the redwoods would end it. I believed distance would act like a switch, flip it, and whatever had followed me out of that forest would fall silent. That's how fear usually works for me. It fades when the threat is gone. But this fear didn't fade. It relocated. For days afterward, every quiet space felt suspect. The pause between passing cars at an intersection, the hollow silence of my apartment at night, even familiar sounds, the refrigerator kicking on, the building settling, carried a weight they'd never had before. My body reacted before my mind could catch up, muscles tensing, breath shortening, heart preparing for something unnamed. I kept replaying that moment on the road when my headlights caught that shape at the edge of the forest. The problem wasn't that I couldn't explain what I saw. The problem was that part of me didn't want to. Explanation would shrink it, cage it, make it manageable. And whatever had been out there didn't feel small. It felt old, settled, like it had always been there and always would be, long after my fear burned itself out. I avoided camping for a while, told myself I needed a break, that work was busy, that fuel prices were up, easy excuses. The truth was simpler and harder. I didn't trust myself anymore. Not my courage, but my judgment. I'd ignored every internal warning that night because I wanted the trip to mean something. I wanted solitude to fix what had broken in me. Instead, I'd learned how thin the line was between peace and danger, and how easily pride could blur it. When I finally worked up the nerve to inspect the van properly, I found more than just the dent. Along the seam near the rear window, the metal was warped, bowed inward as if something had leaned there and listened. I ran my fingers over it slowly, feeling the cold distortion under my skin. The memory came back uninvited, the dragging sound, the sense of being assessed, not hunted, evaluated. That distinction haunted me most. Animals act on instinct, curiosity, hunger, fear. What I felt that night carried something else, restraint. Choice, the idea that whatever moved through those trees could have done more and didn't sat heavy in my chest. Mercy implies intention, and intention implies awareness. I started researching the area obsessively, not because I believed I'd find answers, but because I couldn't stop myself. Old ranger logs, local forums, offhand comments buried in threads about weird nights and don't camp too deep during shoulder season. Stories that stopped just short of saying anything concrete, written by people who sounded embarrassed even as they typed. The common thread wasn't creatures or legends. It was silence, reports that went nowhere, conversations that ended abruptly, people who packed up early and never explained why. One post stuck with me. A guy mentioned hearing heavy knocks in sequence, spaced too evenly to be random. He said it felt like the forest was communicating with itself. Mapping. When someone asked him what he thought it was, he never replied. I stopped looking after that. Spring turned into summer. The nights grew warmer, longer. The dent in the van became just another flaw, easy to ignore if I didn't look too closely. Life resumed its shape, but something in me had shifted permanently. I found myself paying closer attention to the edges of things. The spaces just outside the light, the moments just before sound. I trusted my discomfort more. If a place felt wrong, I didn't argue with it. I left. The next time I camped, it was months later, far from redwoods, in an open desert park with wide sightlines and constant wind. I chose a site near others. I told myself it was practical. It was also fear, carefully managed. That first night, as the wind rattled the awning and coyotes yipped in the distance, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not relief, acceptance. The wild isn't a backdrop. It's not scenery for our healing or our escape. It's an active presence, layered with histories we don't get to read and rules we don't get to rewrite. That night in March, I treated it like a stage set, something that existed for my experience alone. The redwoods corrected me. Sometimes I think about going back, standing at the edge of that same campground in daylight, listening to tourists laugh and kids run between trees older than memory. I imagine how normal it would look. How harmless. That's the trick, I think. Places don't advertise what they're capable of. They wait. I don't know what made those thuds. I don't know what stood at the edge of the road and watched me flee. And I've come to understand that knowing might be worse than not. Mystery has edges. Answers don't always. What I do know is this. Fear isn't always a flaw. Sometimes it's a signal, owned over thousands of years, passed down quietly until it lands in your chest at exactly the right moment. Ignoring it doesn't make you brave. It makes you available. That night, something massive moved in the dark. It left marks on metal and deeper ones somewhere less visible. It taught me that survival isn't about confronting every unknown. Sometimes it's about recognizing when you've been noticed and choosing to leave before curiosity turns into something else. I still love the road. I still love sleeping with the world just outside thin walls. But I no longer pretend that nature is neutral. It watches back. And if you listen closely enough, it tells you when you're no longer welcome. The thuds haven't followed me again, but I hear them sometimes, in memory, slow and deliberate, reminding me of the night I learned the forest doesn't need to chase you to change you. It only needs you to hear it once. The first thing I remember noticing was how quiet the snow made everything feel. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind that presses against your ears until you start listening for things you hope you won't hear. My name is Evan Mercer. I was 39 that winter, a mechanical engineer from Fort Collins, Colorado, the kind of man who trusted systems, probabilities, weather reports, and his own ability to stay calm when things went sideways. I'd been RV camping for nearly 15 years by then. Desert heat, mountain storms, coastal winds. I'd learned to read environments the way some people read faces. Or at least I thought I had. In December of 2021, I drove my Volkswagen Rialta north into Yellowstone National Park, one of the few places in the lower 48 that still feels bigger than human intention. I told myself the trip was about solitude, about slowing down, about proving quietly, privately, that I hadn't grown afraid of cold or isolation or the long nights that come with winter camping. The truth was less noble. That year had taken something out of me. My father had died in March, sudden and unceremonious, and the house I grew up in felt hollow every time I visited my mother. Work had gone remote, then meaningless. Noise everywhere, but nothing saying anything important. I wanted silence. I wanted a place that didn't care how I felt. Yellowstone in winter doesn't care at all. I parked in a permitted winter access area not far from the Madison River, a stretch of land surrounded by frozen lodgepole pines and open snowfields that reflected moonlight like dull metal. The ranger who checked my papers looked at my RV longer than necessary. "Cold's coming in tonight," she said. "Colder than forecast." I nodded. I had extra propane, thermal skirting, a backup generator. I trusted preparation. I trusted planning. By the time dusk settled, the temperature was already dropping faster than it should have. The kind of cold that sneaks in through seams you didn't know existed. I set the stabilizers, sealed the skirting, and watched my breath fog the windshield as if the vehicle itself were exhaling. The forest felt different after dark. Not hostile, not threatening. Attentive. Snow muffles distance. Sound doesn't travel the way it should. You lose depth perception, not visually, but emotionally. Everything feels closer than it is and farther at the same time. I remember standing outside the RV, boots sinking into powder, listening to the low hiss of the propane line and the faint creak of trees adjusting to the cold. That was when I heard what I told myself was an elk. It came from the tree line to the west. A long, hollow sound, broken in the middle, like breath caught in a throat that wasn't shaped right for speech. I'd heard elk calls before. This one had the same rhythm, but something about it lingered too long at the end, flattening into a tone that made my skin tighten. I stood there longer than I should have, trying to decide whether unease counted as evidence. Denial is a quiet thing. It doesn't argue. It just explains. You're tired. Sound carries strangely in cold air. You wanted isolation. This is what it sounds like. I went back inside and locked the door, more out of habit than fear. That night, the RV contracted as the temperature dropped. Panels popped softly. The heating system cycled on and off with mechanical patience. I lay in my bunk, fully dressed, listening, counting seconds between gusts of wind and the occasional crack of ice shifting along the river. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a smell. Not smoke, not rot. Something organic. Damp. Like wet wool left too long in a cold place. It was faint, barely there, but it didn't belong inside the RV. I checked the vents, the seals, the storage compartments. Nothing. The smell faded after a few minutes, leaving behind the kind of uncertainty that sticks harder than fear. I didn't sleep much after that. Morning came pale and brittle. The sun didn't rise so much as appear, a weak disk behind thin cloud cover. When I opened the door, cold air rushed in like it had been waiting. That's when I saw the tracks. They circled the RV at a distance of maybe 15 feet. Slow, deliberate impressions pressed deep into untouched snow. Not paw prints, not hooves. Each mark showed a heel, a midfoot, 5 toe shapes, elongated, uneven, bare. I stood frozen on the RV steps, heart thudding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The tracks weren't random. They didn't wander. They followed a path, one full circuit around the vehicle, then another, tighter this time, closer to the doors, the windows. I crouched despite the cold, examining one print more closely. It was larger than my boot. The toes were splayed as if the foot had flexed against the ice. No drag marks, no signs of stumbling. Whoever or whatever made them had walked calmly, slowly. I told myself it was a prank, some idiot with no boots and a death wish. I told myself that because the alternative required accepting that something had been close to me all night, breathing, standing, listening. The smell from the night before came back to me then, uninvited. I checked for signs of snowmobiles. None. No tracks leading in or out, just the prints appearing near the tree line and fading back into it, as if the forest had exhaled them and then swallowed them again. That was the first time panic brushed against me. Not fully formed, just a pressure behind the eyes. I took photos with my phone, hands shaking enough to blur the first few. I radioed the ranger station. Static. Tried again. Nothing but white noise and a faint clicking that pulsed irregularly, like distant knocks. I told myself radios fail in cold weather. Denial again, doing its gentle work. I spent the next few hours pretending the day was normal. Made coffee, ate a protein bar I didn't taste, checked weather updates that hadn't refreshed since the night before. The temperature never climbed above 0. By mid-afternoon, the wind shifted. That's when the sounds started. Not calls this time. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, crunching snow in measured intervals, stopping just beyond the range where I could see clearly through the frosted windows. Each time I thought I'd pinpointed the direction, the sound came from somewhere else. Circling again. My rational mind tried to assemble explanations: thermal cracking, shifting ice, auditory hallucinations born of isolation and stress. But my body didn't care about explanations. My body knew cadence, weight, intention. Whoever was out there wasn't lost. They were patient. I remember gripping the steering wheel, engine idling, debating whether to leave. Pride argued with instinct. Leaving felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to name. Then came the knock. Not loud, not violent. 3 slow taps against the rear panel of the RV. Metal carries sound differently in cold. Each tap rang through the frame, clean and deliberate, followed by silence so complete it felt engineered. I didn't answer. I didn't move. Another knock came, this time on the driver's side door, exactly at the height of a standing person's knuckles. That was when denial finally cracked. Whatever was outside knew where I was, knew how the RV was laid out, knew I was inside, listening. I reached for the ignition, breath shaking, and that was when I noticed something new outside the windshield. Fresh tracks forming in the snow, one by one, approaching the front of the vehicle. Bare feet. Walking closer. The engine turned over with a sound that felt too loud for the moment, a mechanical confession echoing into the trees, and for a split second I thought I'd made a mistake, that whatever stood outside would react to the noise the way an animal reacts to prey that suddenly moves. My hands were slick on the wheel. I didn't look down at the pedals. I didn't look anywhere except straight ahead, where the windshield framed the snowfield like a stage set for something I did not want to see. Another step appeared in the snow. Then another. The prints came into view slowly, not rushing, not lunging, just advancing with the confidence of something that knew I was already contained. The shape of the footfall was clearer up close, the arch pressed deep. The toes bit into the snow with an almost deliberate spread, as if testing the ground, as if enjoying the sensation. No shoes, no hesitation. I felt an absurd, overwhelming certainty that if I turned on the headlights fully, I would see a face. So I didn't. I put the RV in gear and eased forward, tires crunching loudly, violently compared to the careful sounds outside. The tracks stopped forming. I didn't know whether that meant the thing had stepped back or simply stopped moving. Either option tightened my chest. As the vehicle lurched ahead, something scraped along the passenger side panel. Not a hit, not an impact, but a long, dragging contact that vibrated through the frame. My teeth clicked together. I pressed the accelerator harder than I should have on ice, felt the back wheel's fishtail, then catch. In the side mirror, just for a fraction of a second, I saw movement near the tree line. Tall, upright, too still to be running, too fast to be walking. I didn't look again. The road out was a narrow, plowed ribbon bordered by snowbanks higher than the hood. My breath came in shallow pulls, fogging the glass faster than the defroster could clear it. The smell from the night before was back, stronger now, seeping through the vents despite everything being sealed. Wet, animal, threaded with something sour. I kept driving. The ranger station was only 6 miles away. I told myself that over and over, like a mantra that could substitute for courage. 6 minutes. Fewer if the road was clear. It wasn't. Half a mile down, the engine temperature light flickered. No, I whispered as if the RV could hear me and choose otherwise. The cold had thickened something. Fuel line, coolant, some small part that mattered more than I'd ever appreciated. The engine began to stutter, each cough a small betrayal. I feathered the gas, coaxing it forward, heart pounding loud enough that I missed other sounds at first. Then I realized the crunching wasn't coming from my tires alone. There were footsteps again, matching my speed. I glanced at the mirror, then immediately regretted it. The snowbank to my right was unbroken, pristine, except for a line of fresh impressions keeping pace just beyond the road's edge. Bare feet. Deep, confident. Each step landed with a precision that made my own movements feel clumsy, panicked. I accelerated. The footsteps did not fall behind. Panic is not loud at first. It starts as a narrowing, a tunnel vision that erases options until only one remains: move. My mind stopped offering explanations. There was no room for them anymore. Whatever this was, it wasn't curious. It wasn't confused. It was following. The engine sputtered harder, then died. The RV rolled to a stop, silence rushing in so fast it made my ears ring. The footsteps slowed too, then stopped altogether. The sudden absence of sound was worse than the noise had been. It felt like a held breath shared between me and something just outside the thin walls of fiberglass and insulation. I didn't turn off the ignition. I didn't open the door. I sat there, shoulders hunched, every muscle locked, listening to my own heartbeat hammering against my ribs. A shape passed in front of the headlights. Not fully illuminated, just a distortion, like heat shimmer, but darker, denser. It moved from left to right, unhurried, blocking the weak glow for a second longer than it should have if it were human. Then came the smell again, overwhelming now, filling the cabin until my eyes watered. Something touched the hood, not struck, rested. The metal creaked softly under the pressure, a slow downward flex as if weight were being tested. My mind conjured an image I didn't want, hands spread on the hood, fingers splayed wide of nails or something like them, scraping faint lines through frost. A sound followed. Not a knock, breathing. Close enough that it fogged the glass from the outside in uneven bursts. I could see the condensation bloom and fade, not rhythmic like mine, but staggered, irregular, as if whatever lungs produced it were not shaped quite right. I thought about my father then, absurdly, about the last thing he'd said to me, about how he'd always trusted his instincts and regretted the times he didn't. The memory hurt worse than fear. "I hear you," I whispered, not sure who I was talking to. The breathing stopped. Pressure lifted from the hood. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the engine coughed once, twice, and roared back to life without me touching the key. The sudden vibration startled me so badly I almost stalled it again. I slammed my foot down, tires screaming as the RV surged forward, clipping the edge of the snowbank and showering powder into the air. I didn't see footprints keeping pace anymore. I didn't slow down. The ranger station lights appeared like a promise I didn't deserve, glowing warm against the blue-white dark. I pulled in too fast, skidded, came to a stop inches from the building. I was out of the RV before the engine fully cut, boots hitting the ground hard enough to hurt. The door to the station opened almost immediately. 2 rangers stepped out, hands already near their radios, faces alert. "Sir," one of them called. "Are you okay?" I tried to answer. My mouth open, nothing came out at first. "There's something out there," I finally managed, voice hoarse, unrecognizable to my own ears. "Tracks, barefoot, it followed me." They exchanged a look. Not disbelief, not alarm, but something like weary recognition. They took my statement inside, warm air hitting me like a wave. I showed them the photos. The radio logs showed interference at the exact times I'd tried calling. The older ranger nodded slowly, jaw tight. "We've had reports," she said carefully. "Not often, mostly in winter. We don't put them in the public briefings." "What is it?" I asked. She didn't answer directly. "You're not staying out there tonight." I didn't argue. I left Yellowstone the next morning under escort, the RV running smoother than it had any right to. The road behind me was empty. No tracks. No signs of pursuit. But weeks later, back home, I found something that still wakes me up at night. On the underside of the hood, half hidden by road grime, were faint lines etched into the metal. 5 parallel marks, curved slightly, as if made by fingers that had pressed and dragged, testing strength. I don't camp in winter anymore. And when snow falls just right, when sound gets swallowed and the world feels too close and too far at once, I still smell that damp animal scent. And I know with a certainty that planning can't touch, that some places remember you after you leave. The weeks after Yellowstone passed the way deep water moves, slow on the surface, heavy underneath. I told people I'd had mechanical trouble and left it at that. That explanation fit neatly into conversations. It didn't demand follow-up. It didn't force anyone to picture bare feet in snow where no one should be walking. But the body remembers what the mouth refuses to say. Every night, I replayed the sounds in my head. The measured crunch of steps matching my pace, the soft knock placed exactly where a human hand would fall, the breathing that fogged the glass like a deliberate reminder that thin walls mean nothing to something patient. Sleep came in fragments. When it did, it carried dreams where I was back inside the RV, listening to something circle just out of sight, never rushing, never stopping. I told myself trauma reshapes memory, that fear fills in gaps with fiction. I tried to believe that the longer I stayed away from snow, from silence, from that kind of cold, the less real it would feel. That lasted until I opened the hood. It was early January, a week after I'd returned home. I was checking fluids, doing the kind of routine maintenance that had always grounded me. The engine was still warm, the smell of oil and metal familiar and comforting. That's when I saw the marks. They weren't deep. They didn't gouge. They were subtle enough that I could have missed them if I hadn't been looking closely. 5 faint arcs etched into the paint on the underside of the hood, spaced too evenly to be random, curved in a way that suggested pressure applied and then slowly released. I ran my fingers over them. The metal was smooth, cold. No burrs, no chipped paint, just lines, like a memory pressed into a surface that didn't know how to forget. I closed the hood harder than necessary and stepped back, suddenly unsure of the distance between my thoughts and the world around me. The smell hit me then, faint but unmistakable, riding on the winter air, wet, animal, wrong. I stood there until it faded. I didn't report it. I didn't photograph it. Some part of me understood that evidence invites questions, and questions invite answers you can't put back once you've heard them. Instead, I sold the RV 2 months later at a loss I didn't care about and told the buyer it had seen too many winters. Life narrowed after that. I stayed closer to cities. I avoided national parks in the off-season. I learned which kinds of silence made my shoulders tense and which ones I could tolerate. Friends noticed the change. They called it caution. They called it maturity. They were wrong. It was vigilance. I started reading, not folklore, not conspiracy forums, but ranger reports, archived logs, declassified incident summaries that never made it into glossy brochures. Patterns emerged if you looked long enough. Winter sightings, interference with radios, footprints that didn't fit any known species, smells reported independently by people who had never met. Always remote, always cold, always patient. The most unsettling part wasn't that these reports existed. It was how often they ended the same way. Subject departed area without further incident. No evidence found upon follow-up. Cause undetermined. I recognized the language. It was the voice of people who had seen something they couldn't categorize and chosen, consciously or not, to let the wilderness keep its secrets. A year later, I went back to Yellowstone. Not to camp, not to test myself, but to stand at the edge of it in daylight, surrounded by other people, noise, and motion. Snow fell lightly, softening the world again. I watched families take photos, children throwing snowballs, couples laughing into scarves. Nothing happened, and that was the point. Whatever had walked around my RV didn't belong to moments like this. It belonged to the in-between, when the land is quiet enough to listen back, when humans are present but alone, when denial feels easier than instinct. As I turned to leave, I noticed something near the tree line. A patch of snow disturbed not by prints, but by absence, as if something had stood there long enough to warm the ground beneath it. I didn't approach. Some lessons don't require confirmation. I drive through winter now instead of into it. I respect the cold the way you respect a stranger who hasn't decided what you are yet. And when people ask me why I don't camp anymore, I tell them the truth in a way they can hear. Some places don't want company. They just tolerate it. Because fear isn't always about what chases you. Sometimes it's about what watches, waits, and lets you leave, knowing you'll carry the memory so it doesn't have to follow. And on certain nights, when the snow falls heavy and sound disappears, I swear I can hear footsteps that stop when I stop thinking about them, reminding me that escape isn't always about distance. Sometimes it's about being allowed to go.